I'm Chris Todd from Northeastern REMC in Columbia City, Indiana. Welcome to Along Those Lines.
This episode of Along Those Lines is supported by Livewire, a new video series from NRECA giving you a direct line to the issues that matter most to your co-op, the impact they have on your communities, and insight from experts to help you stay one step ahead.
Hi, everyone. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, and the challenges they face. I'm your host, Scott Hoffman. What you're hearing is the sound of millions of gallons of water rushing over the spillway of the Bonneville Dam, a 1.2 gigawatt hydroelectric facility on the Columbia River near Portland, Oregon. Bonneville is one of more than 100 large, federally run hydropower plants found throughout the United States, but mainly in the West and Northeast. These dams, as well as more than 1,000 smaller non-federal hydro generators, produce up to 100,000 megawatts of zero-carbon power for America's homes and businesses. They are marvels of engineering that have helped bring development and prosperity to the many regions they serve. But they're also in the crosshairs of interest groups that say they should be closed because of their environmental impacts, and others who want to sell the facilities to private industry. Here to talk about these important issues are Kurt Miller. He's the executive director of Northwest RiverPartners, a not-for-profit based in Vancouver, Washington that advocates for the region's hydropower users, and Troy Berglund, the community development and member relations manager at Benton Rural Electric Association, a 15,000-meter electric cooperative in Prosser, Washington that gets most of its power from dams on the nearby Snake River. Later, we'll talk to Ashley Slater. She's the vice president of regulatory affairs at NRECA. Kurt, Troy, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
It is great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, Kurt, I want to start with you with sort of a basic history of hydropower, particularly in the Northwest, but hydropower more generally. How many dams in the Northwest? Where are they? When were they built? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Northwest is like a hydropower power zone. We produce 40% in the entire nation's hydroelectric generation. On average, that looks like about 16,000 average megawatts. That's about, it's enough to power 16 cities the size of Seattle. So it's a really, really big resource for us. We have both federal and non-federal dams in the Northwest. And so that means like the Bonneville Power Administration, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. They operate and or market electricity from hydroelectric dams in this region. But we also have private dam owners. Some of the most predominant are the Grant County, Chelan County, and Douglas County PUDs in central Washington. And then also folks who own dams in western Washington as well. So it's a really diverse mix. Dams are like people. No two are exactly the same.
Like co-ops, too.
Exactly.
So, Troy, maybe you can walk us through some of the developments that Kurt was just talking about and how it's sort of been integral to the success of electric cooperatives in the region, specifically Benton REA. And if you could just let us know how much of Benton's power does come from hydro.
Great question. The hydroelectricity is absolutely paramount to Benton REA and the utilities across the Northwest. We receive about 85% of all of our electricity from hydroelectricity, and so more than 95% of our electricity is carbon-free. So hydro is just a tremendous resource. And as you know, co-ops were formed to serve these rural areas, the very difficult to serve areas. Benton REA specifically serves a very desert, high wind area, and then we serve the top of White Pass, the Cascade Mountains, a U.S. Forest Service, so very difficult terrain, very sparsely populated, economically challenging to serve those with low-cost rates. And so hydropower is just the bedrock of our ability to be able to bring that quality of life to these businesses and farms. And so I can't underscore how important it has been to our ability to bring low-cost power and keep things affordable to our region and reliable, I think, hand in hand.
The thing I'd like to add is what Troy was saying is Benton REA's picture is a lot like the picture for a lot of the folks in the Northwest. The hydropower system, because we do have such an abundant resource here, we have the least carbon-intensive electric grid of any region in the United States. We have the most affordable clean energy in the country and the lowest energy burdens for customers in the country. So we really are very blessed by having the system here, and it makes a huge difference to everyone who lives here, whether they recognize it or not.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's actually a good point. And I wonder if we could take a few minutes to just sort of get our listeners up to speed on how one of these facilities actually works. We're all sort of familiar with that sheer wall that you see at the Hoover Dam. But Troy, can you sort of tell us what's going on behind that wall and around that structure?
Yeah, so Kurt alluded to the fact that no dams are alike, and so that's true. There's run-of-the-river type dams, there's pump storage dams. There's a lot of different ways in which hydroelectric can come, but essentially they all work the same way to where you have what's called a penstock that the water travels through, it goes down to a turbine, turns the turbine, and that's where electricity is generated. It is just a tremendous resource, natural resource of kinetic energy, and a lot of electricity obviously is produced, so you have substations and transmission lines. That's why you see this big wall of cement, like you alluded to, but then a bunch of huge transmission lines traveling from it to bring that power from where it's generated to where it's used. In a nutshell, that's how they work.
That's great. And they're amazing because you can reuse that water as it goes downstream. You can reuse it for different dams as it goes. It's an amazing resource. And sort of along those same lines, Kurt, I read a quote from you recently where you called hydropower a superpower. And I wonder if you could tell us what you meant by that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I love superheroes. So that's part of that. But the other part is hydropower is a superpower. I mean, when it comes to renewable electricity, right? Because one of the challenges that we always hear about wind and solar power is while they're clean energy resources, they're also intermittent resources. And that means that from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, they have fluctuations in their fuel supply. The sun goes down at night or the wind stops blowing and then picks up again really quickly. And so you need, in a system like this, you need a glue to hold all that together because supply and demand have to be perfectly balanced from second to second, or else you can have major blackouts. And so hydropower is a superpower because it essentially can store water behind that cement wall that we talked about in its reservoir and then release it when it's needed. And so that ability to store and release and store and release, it allows it to keep the system, essentially acts as a giant clean energy battery that allows us to keep the system in balance. So that is why it's a superpower, is because it really comes in with its own battery storage.
That's great. And Troy, I want to talk about some of the sort of the ancillary benefits to creating these hydro facilities. Beyond power production, there are these benefits associated with the way the water is stored and the fact that it is usable as a recreation. I mean, you have it right there on the ground in your territory. Can you talk about some of the extra benefits associated with it?
Yeah, sure. The benefits that come from it are just tremendous. It's beyond electricity. So you have flood management. Before the dams were on the Columbia and Snake Rivers, Portland wasn't infrequent for it to have serious flooding, and many other communities along that path. But it has navigation through those systems. And so right now we have a tremendous amount of ag products that travel down the river system to ports. And if those weren't there, if the Snake River dams weren't there, all that product is going on truck or rail, and those have carbon emissions associated with it. They have traffic congestion and safety concerns with that. And then as another additional benefit, there's the recreation and tourism that really comes from these. So there's just a tremendous amount of benefits. And to be frank, a lot of the industry that we have in our area and the agriculture, and ag has a new spotlight on it with the pandemic and the focus on these shortages. So, people are realizing just how critically important that is. And without the irrigation that came from these dams, we just would struggle to meet those demands out there. And so that's critically important.
So we talked about the good things associated with it. There are also some challenges associated with hydro. We know that there are concerns about the impact that dams have on salmon and other wildlife. There have been a number of lawsuits and campaigns that advocate for either breaching or bypassing or removing these dams completely. Troy, as your co-op is a recipient of hydropower, could you walk us through what's going on with these efforts that are sort of against hydro and kind of give us a sense of a scenario of what it would look like if they were successful in terms of how it would affect power availability, power price, and quality of life?
I believe everything is being done with good intentions. The intention is to protect salmon and endangered species, and that's the effort to breach the lower Snake River dams. That's really the genesis. Fortunately for us, the two can coexist. Fish and the dams can coexist. They have a 96% success rate through the dams. And really, we've identified that ocean conditions are a primary factor, and reducing carbon emissions is the best way to battle that. So the dams are essential. But life without the dams, for one, we would see huge sticker shock for price increases to our customers and retail customers. We're talking 25% right from the get-go, and then probably up from there. And that would hit the low income the hardest, for sure. And then you obviously have the other issues with reliability. So no doubt we've already relied on the Snake River dams to keep electricity flowing in our service area. So without those dams, we would have already incurred outages. So more outages would result in reliability, plus transportation of goods, that, increased emissions associated with that. So there's a lot of really devastating factors that would come into play if those dams didn't maintain their existence.
Yeah. Now, Kurt, I hear amazing things about what your group is doing on the advocacy side and sort of the explanation side. I wonder if you could walk us through some of the efforts that you've been making to respond to these sort of special interests and sort of educate the public and policymakers on the value of these dams.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great question. The issue is, and I really like where Troy started, which is, there is disagreement about dams and salmon and whether they can coexist or not coexist. And, we do really feel like the recent science does point to ocean conditions as the primary driver, because salmon in rivers without dams are doing about the same as salmon in rivers with dams, and it really is about how many salmon are returning from the ocean. But one of the challenges here is, there is a really powerful contingent of activist groups. And again, it doesn't, I'm not saying that these are bad groups at all, and they're groups that people are their household names, and you may support them in certain respects. But they bring literally, over $1 billion to the game in terms of their annual assets and revenues. The groups that came out formally in support, rather, of removing the lower Snake River dams in the last environmental impact statement, they had revenues and assets that year in 2020 of $1.6 billion. That's billion with a B. And so to understand the kind of clout that these groups have, their grassroots infrastructure, their ability to spend on these issues, it's a really formidable challenge. So for us at Northwest River Partners, we have really asked our members for a lot of support to run campaigns to help educate the public about the importance of hydropower. And our data show something really important, and that is the more people know about hydropower, the more likely they are to support it. And that is because it has superpowers, as I shared with you before. And once people understand that the role of hydropower in filling the gaps, with wind and solar power, and doing that in a carbon-free way, especially in light of this region and many others retiring their coal plants and natural gas plants to fight climate change, I think all of a sudden that message clicks, right? So for us, the key is to make sure enough people hear that message that they understand what's at risk and what's at stake, and then they can make an educated choice about whether this is a resource that they should be supporting. So right now, we have a major media effort in Washington State especially, and a little bit in Oregon as well, to promote the benefits of the lower Snake River dams and to let people know why it matters for them to support them. And it's really important because right now, Washington's Governor Inslee, and U.S. Senator Patty Murray from Washington State as well, are engaged in a process which they're calling a joint federal state process, where they're basically going to determine, at least from their perspective, whether or not those dams should be removed. And so it's really important that everyone from across the region and even maybe beyond write to them and get involved to let them know that these dams are really important to our clean, affordable, reliable energy future.
I love the way you both sort of frame that. You're respectfully disagreeing about this issue. You're engaging in a non-combative way. It is quite refreshing to hear that.
Today it is unusual.
We're outside of Washington, D.C. We don't hear that very often. So as we're talking about this existential issue with the dams, I want to get a sense of how you both see hydro fitting into the future of energy production in the United States. Kurt, why don't you start, and then we'll go to you, Troy.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we do as part of our advocacy is we do a lot of research. Because as an advocate group, as a hydropower advocacy group, we know that to be an advocate and have credibility, you actually have to have data to point to, or else everyone will just completely discount what you have to say. So we do spend a lot of time on that. And one of the things that we're seeing now as studies come out in terms of power supply, that The closer you get to a zero carbon grid, and both Washington State and Oregon have passed 100% zero carbon electricity laws recently. Washington's, you have to get to zero carbon grid by 2045. Oregon's, you have to get to a zero carbon grid by 2040. The closer you get to taking all your fossil fuel generation off the grid, all your natural gas, all your coal generation, that generation, which could be used to help keep the grid in balance, all of a sudden is gone, and you're replacing it with intermittent resources, wind and solar power. So basically, the closer you get to a zero carbon grid, the bigger build out that you have to have, it's almost an exponential build out of wind and solar power, because you always have to have enough generation online spinning to meet customer demand at any second. And so what our studies show is the closer you get to that point, the more valuable hydropower becomes. A lot of people think, oh, well, because wind and solar are becoming more prevalent, hydropower is actually diminishing in its importance. But actually, because the grid needs to remain in balance, the amount of generation it would take to replace the lower Snake River dams is basically exponential compared to its nameplate generation capacity.
So, Troy, how do you see it sort of playing out on the ground in South Central Washington and among the co-ops in the region?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge for us. And I think that Kurt really described the importance of hydropower very well from a reliability standpoint. And I'm going to focus more on the cost, because as you get to those last percentage of carbon free, it really, the cost to achieve that goes way up. And so that's going to affect, I mentioned the low income being hit the hardest when you have significant rate increases and stuff. But it also, we're talking businesses, we're talking industries, which are jobs. And as we've seen, the economy can be pretty delicate. And when we have some negative effects, it can really ripple through things and have some long-term negative effects. So I think that's our biggest struggle, is twofold. One, maintaining the reliability, and two is maintaining costs that are reasonable to keep power on, because it's an essential critical resource that people's livelihood depends on, make a difference in their lives, period. And so this is a huge challenge we have. Hydropower is just an absolutely critical piece of that and needs to be maintained, at least, if not growing in it as a resource. So hopefully we can meet that challenge, but it is a stiff challenge for sure.
Well, I love the work you guys are doing, and honestly, you're as eloquent on the issue as I've heard. So I really appreciate your coming on and talking to us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really exciting to get to be here, and we love our friends at NRECA, so thank you.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Let's pause now for a word from our sponsor, and when we come back, we'll hear from a regulatory expert talking about the national impact of hydropower.
This episode of Along Those Lines is supported by LiveWire. Growing opportunities for rural broadband, infrastructure resources for co-ops, supply chain complications. Each month, NRECA's new video series talks to co-op leaders about critical issues impacting electric cooperatives and their communities, and national experts for insight and resources. Check it out and subscribe on cooperative.com/livewire.
I'm Erica Meyer from Mountain View Electric Association in Falcon, Colorado. You're listening to Along Those Lines.
Welcome back. Ashley Slater is NRECA's Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and the association's point person on hydropower issues. She has a long history working on hydro in the Pacific Northwest. Ashley, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Scott. Really excited to be here.
So I know you grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so you are intimately familiar with how hydropower can impact a community. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, Scott, I got to tell you that hydropower is a part of me. It's in my blood. Look, I grew up on the doorstep of the mighty Columbia River. And as a child, I knew that we were reaping the benefits of a low cost, always available, carbon-free power supply. And that contributed to the quality of our life in the most beautiful place on earth, the Pacific Northwest. The other thing I learned later in life was that in addition to providing a power resource, the federal dams on the Columbia River, where I grew up, also allow for multi-purpose benefits like critical flood control, navigation, recreation, irrigation, all those really important benefits that go beyond power supply.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier with the other guests. And I know sort of in that spirit, you're in charge of NRECA's regulatory work with federal agencies. So what are your priorities when it comes to hydropower and preserving not only the power that comes out of these dams, but all the multi-purpose benefits that you just mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one of the things that attracted me to this position at NRECA. I had come from a co-op, a G&T co-op in the Pacific Northwest called PNGC Power, and spent a lot of time in that position protecting our access to a federal hydropower supply that frankly supplied 95% of those that we served at the end of the line at this G&T cooperative. And so being able to come to NRECA, our national trade association, the national trade associations for co-ops across the country, I was able to champion the cause, or am able to champion the cause at the national level. I am the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, and so that means that I lead a team of subject matter experts that are front-facing to the executive branch, all the decisions that are made by the federal government and the administration. And because much of our hydropower comes from federal power marketing administrations, a lot of it falls under my purview. The PMAs, the Bonneville Power Administration and the others are located within the Department of Energy. And so being able to have that relationship to be able to talk about these issues is really critical. Kind of stepping back from the region and my role at NRECA and kind of talking at the national level, I always kind of remind folks that I get to advocate for national ongoing access to America's hydropower resources. Co-ops have been using hydropower for more than 75 years. Over 715 of our cooperatives in 40 states utilize hydro as a source of power supply. And so it's really exciting.
Yeah, and I want to get into the advocacy on some people's part to either curtail or completely do away with that access. But one of the things that we're talking about in this podcast that's so key and so critical is this energy transition that we're in the middle of. Moving away from fossil fuel generation, moving more toward renewables, which can be, depending on what they are intermittent and less reliable than what we're used to. I'd like to get a sense of what you and your team are telling the federal agencies about this issue, how critical hydro is to maintaining this sort of continuity of reliability and affordability.
So we like all sources of electricity, of power. One of the reasons why we really like hydropower is because it acts as a giant battery of sorts, especially these big projects with reservoirs, so that hydropower actually can facilitate the integration of intermittent resources, as you mentioned, Scott, like solar and like wind, that are also carbon-free. And I have to remind folks all the time that hydro is a carbon-free, always available, dispatchable resource, again, that can integrate intermittent renewables like wind and solar. So it's an enabler. So for those who like wind and solar, they should love hydropower. The other point that I'd kind of like to make along these lines is, interestingly, this week, NERC, the regulatory authority responsible for risks to the reliability and security of the grid, came out with a summer assessment, kind of ringing the alarm bells about swaths of the country that are at risks of power outage this summer due to high demand, with folks running their air conditioning, demand kind of going through the roof. And what we really need, are different generating resources that allow us to continue to ensure that we can provide reliable power supply. And that takes kind of that always available baseload capacity that we talk about. Again, we don't pick and choose generating resources, but the reality is that when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, you can't instantly call upon those resources to provide dispatchable power supply. You really need that baseload power in the form of thermal generation, in the form of hydropower, in the form of nuclear. And so I just always point that out. Don't forget about hydro when you talk about dispatchable capacity.
Yeah, and the odd thing is there's some, in California, they don't consider hydropower to be a renewable. And I know you have been fighting this and you've been dealing with this issue for a long time. There's lawsuits and campaigns to sort of close or breach the hydro dams. There's these infrequent spasms of wanting to sell off the resources. Give us a sense of what you're telling the government officials that you talk to about why that's such a bad idea and what it would mean to these communities. I mean, there's a certain scenario that would take place if these dams suddenly weren't there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love about representing the interests of cooperatives is we live in the communities that we serve. And so our members know what's best for their communities. And it's just part of our cooperative principles to balance environmental stewardship with economic prosperity. And with hydropower, we've always believed that you can have both environmental stewardship, given that it's a 100% carbon-free resource, and economic prosperity. One of the things that I'll point out is, in the Northwest, we love our salmon. They're iconic species to our region and part of again, who we are in the Northwest. And the ratepayers that receive hydropower from the Bonneville Power Administration, including electric co-ops and municipalities, actually contribute to the largest mitigation effort for ESA-listed salmon in the world. Ratepayers spend about $750 million annually to mitigate through the trials and tribulations of the multi-dam power system to ensure safe passage of these iconic listed species. We contribute to removable spillway weirs, habitat restoration, hatchery, this sort of all-H approach to protecting salmon. So it's not just about the hydropower, it's also about the environmental stewardship and the real dollars that ratepayers, including electric co-ops, put in to contribute to the prosperity and the mitigation of salmon loss throughout the system. So I would argue that we can have both.
Yeah, I mean, there's this idea that there's got to be a trade-off with what's good for society and for these communities and what's good for the natural resources. Ashley, this is fascinating stuff. Best of luck with your efforts to make the case for hydro, and thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity and the conversation. I hope you have me back.
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks.
And thanks to you, our listeners, and our sponsor, NRECA's Livewire. For more on this and other podcasts, visit us at electric.coop. Until next time, for Along Those Lines, I'm Scott Hoffman.
I'm Leon Espinoza from Pioneer Utility Resources in Hillsboro, Oregon. Thanks for listening to Along Those Lines. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app.